As Emma stood on stage, her voice strong and unwavering, the audience hung on to every word. She shared her story of abandonment, resilience, and triumph, each sentence cutting deeper into the heart of a man sitting in the shadows. His hands trembled as he recognized the woman speaking, his daughter, whom he had left behind years ago. A rush of memories flooded him, the promises he broke, the choices he couldn't undo. Now, as she spoke of love and second chances, his chest tightened. The world saw a hero. He saw the child he had failed. But before diving into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy heartfelt tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our stories. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls of the modest room. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the ceiling, her breath catching in her chest. This wasn't just another morning. It was the morning. She shifted her gaze to the familiar chaos surrounding her. The small room she shared with Lucy, her adoptive sister, was a collage of their intertwined lives, photographs of their family laughing at the park, newspaper clippings detailing Emma's social projects, and Lucy's vibrant sketches pinned haphazardly to the walls. The clutter felt grounding, but today it only heightened her unease. Emma swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The ache in her stomach wasn't from hunger. It was the kind of gnawing anticipation that came before something life-altering. Her thoughts spiraled as she stood by the window, watching the city awaken outside. Cars honked, people hurried along the sidewalks, and the distant chatter of life buzzed below. Today's the day my life might change forever, she thought, her hands clenching the windowsill. She could almost hear the echo of her mentor's words from last night. The speech isn't just about the project, Emma. It's about you. You're the heart of this story. Don't let them forget it. Emma inhaled deeply, her reflection catching her off guard in the glass. Her usual composed demeanor was betrayed by the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Could she really do this? Could her words, her story, inspire the change she had always dreamed of? Behind her, Lucy stirred. Emma. Her sleepy voice called out, "You're up early. Nerves?" Emma smiled faintly without turning around. Something like that. As the city continued to hum with its relentless pace, Emma braced herself for the storm ahead, a storm that might just carve a new path in her life, or destroy everything she had worked for. The day had begun, and with it came the weight of her dreams, fears, and the unknown waiting beyond the podium. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread wrapped around Emma like a comforting hug as she walked into the kitchen. Martha's cheerful voice had already started to fill the space, harmonizing with the faint clinking of dishes. "Emma, honey, breakfast is on the table, haha," Martha called out from where she stood, arranging plates with her usual precision. Emma paused for a moment in the doorway, taking in the sight. The kitchen was small but inviting, its worn wooden cabinets and mismatched chairs carrying years of shared meals and conversations. Her adoptive father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, the morning newspaper spread open in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a warm, knowing smile. "Nervous about the big day?" Robert asked, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside. His calm presence had always been a source of strength for her. Emma slipped into a chair, brushing her hair behind her ear. "A little, Dad," she admitted, her voice steady despite the flicker of uncertainty in her chest, but mostly excited. Martha placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "Remember where you came from, Emma," she said, her tone soft yet firm, "and why you're doing this. Let that guide you." Emma nodded, her resolve strengthening as she sipped her coffee. This kitchen, these people, were her foundation, and today they reminded her exactly what she was fighting for. Emma stared into her coffee, her thoughts drifting to a distant, painful memory that never fully faded. She was 8 years old again, standing in the biting cold outside a tall gray building. The man in the suit knelt down, his face a blur in her mind now, but his words crystal clear. Wait here, I'll be back soon." She had clung to that promise for hours, watching cars pass and shadows stretch as the sun dipped below the horizon. But he never returned. Days later, she found herself wandering the streets, hunger and fear her only companions, until Robert appeared. She could still see his kind eyes and hear the gentle concern in his voice. "Hey, little one, are you lost?" That moment had rewritten her story. Robert and Martha didn't just take her in, they gave her a home, a family, and a purpose she'd fight to protect. "Earth to Emma!" Lucy's teasing voice cut through her reverie, snapping her back to the present. Emma blinked, startled, as Lucy leaned against the doorway, a smirk on her face. "You'll be late if you keep daydreaming." "Oh my God, you're right," Emma gasped, bolting up from her seat. She grabbed her bag in a flurry, her heart racing. There was no room for hesitation now. Today was too important. Emma stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. The navy buell blazer and matching pants she wore were simple yet sharp, professional enough for the occasion but not overly intimidating. She ran her hands over the fabric, smoothing out imaginary creases while her mind raced. "You can do this," she whispered, meeting her own gaze in the mirror. Her voice was steady, but her pulse betrayed the flicker of doubt still lingering beneath her calm exterior. "Today's the day to prove that every life matters." The words felt heavy with meaning. For years she had poured her heart into helping those like herself, people society often overlooked or discarded. Now she had the chance to speak for them, to make others see their worth. Her resolve hardened. Emma grabbed her bag and turned toward the door, a determined smile playing on her lips. In the kitchen, Martha and Robert were waiting. Martha handed her a small paper bag. "In case you forget to eat later," she said with a knowing look. "Thanks, Mom," Emma said, her voice soft with affection. Robert reached out to pat her shoulder. "You'll do great, kiddo. Remember, it's not just about the words. It's about the heart behind them." Emma nodded, leaning down to kiss them both on the cheek. She paused by Lucy, who grinned at her from the doorway. "Knock 'em dead, sis," Lucy said, her tone playful but her eyes filled with pride. Emma laughed, the tension in her chest easing just a little. "I'll try." With that, she stepped out of the door and into the brisk morning air. The city buzzed around her as she hurried toward the subway station, her heart pounding in rhythm with her quick steps. She clutched her bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the notes inside as if they were a lifeline. The train roared into the station just as she reached the platform. Emma boarded, finding a seat near the window, and let out a small breath of relief. The familiar hum of the subway enveloped her as the train began to move. She closed her eyes briefly, mentally rehearsing her speech. The words she had written flowed through her mind like a melody she couldn't forget. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not as someone extraordinary, but as someone who was given a chance to be seen, to be heard, to matter." Her grip on the strap of her bag tightened. The stakes had never felt higher. This wasn't just about delivering a good speech. It was about showing the world that people like her, like the children she fought for, deserved more than pity. They deserved opportunities. The train slowed as it approached the next station. Emma opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on her reflection in the window. She looked calm, composed, but she could feel the fire beneath her skin. When the train came to a halt at the convention center stop, Emma stood, her head held high. As she stepped off the subway, the world around her seemed to fall away. There was only the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement and the words echoing in her mind. "Today's the day to make them listen," she thought, her determination unwavering as she approached the doors of the Grand Hall. The Grand Hall loomed ahead, its glass facade gleaming under the morning sun. Emma took a deep breath, her steps quickening as she approached the entrance. Inside, the air was alive with the hum of anticipation, organizers bustling about, speakers rehearsing in hushed corners, and attendees mingling in animated conversations. As Emma stepped through the revolving doors, a young woman with a clipboard hurried toward her. She was petite, with a bright smile and a name tag that read Sarah. Her energy was almost infectious. "Miss Johnson," Sarah exclaimed, her excitement evident. "I'm so glad you're here. Your speech is one of the most anticipated today." Emma offered a nervous smile, her fingers brushing the strap of her bag for reassurance. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I hope I don't disappoint." Sarah waved the thought away with an enthusiastic gesture. "Oh, there's no way you could. Everyone's been talking about your work. It's inspiring, really. You're going to do great." Emma nodded, her confidence bolstered slightly by the young woman's earnest words. "I appreciate that, Sarah, truly." "Let me show you to the green room," Sarah said, motioning for Emma to follow. "You'll have a few minutes to settle in before it's your turn." As they walked, Emma glanced around the bustling venue. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the space, their faces lit with anticipation. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against her, but beneath that, a growing sense of purpose stirred. By the time they reached the green room, Emma felt a steady determination taking root. This was her moment, and she was ready to rise to it. The green room buzzed faintly with muffled sounds from the main hall, but Emma's world had narrowed to the microphone clipped to her lapel. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted it, ensuring it was secure. The cool metal against her fingertips grounded her, and she took a long, steady breath. Her thoughts raced, but a single mantra emerged above the noise. "It's time to shine." The stage manager gave her a quick nod. Emma returned it with a small, nervous smile, squaring her shoulders as she stepped toward the curtain. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, echoing her resolve. On stage, the auditorium was packed, the sea of faces blurring into a single, expectant gaze. Emma paused at the podium, her hands gripping the edges for a moment before releasing them. The room fell silent, an electric anticipation hanging in the air. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the stillness. "My name is Emma Johnson, and I'm here to talk about second chances." The words resonated, drawing the audience closer. Emma let a brief pause hang, scanning the room. She could feel their curiosity, their willingness to listen. It was her chance to seize their hearts, and she wouldn't waste it. Emma began to speak about her past. Her voice softened but didn't waver as she recounted the moment that had shaped her life. The man in the suit, the cold night outside the orphanage, and the days spent lost on the streets. She chose her words carefully, painting the picture without lingering too long in the pain. Instead, she shifted to the warmth that followed, the kindness of Robert, the love of Martha, and the joy of finding Lucy as her sister. "Abandonment doesn't define who we are," Emma said, her voice rising with quiet strength. "It's our choices, our resilience, and the love we find along the way." She paused, her emotions rippling to the surface as she met the eyes of the audience. Some were misty. Others leaned forward as if trying to catch every word. Emma drew a shaky breath, her heart full of gratitude for this platform, this moment. But then, from the back of the room, a sharp voice pierced the silence. Isn't it convenient to tell a sob story when you're standing on a stage? The room gasped collectively, heads swiveling to locate the source of the disruption. Emma's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "Why, don't you tell them the whole truth, Emma?" the voice continued. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, his face shadowed but his tone dripping with accusation. Emma's stomach churned. She recognized the voice immediately. It was him, the man who had abandoned her all those years ago. Her grip on the podium tightened as murmurs rippled through the crowd. The carefully constructed composure she'd built threatened to crumble, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. The man walked closer, his face now illuminated by the stage lights. "You left out the part where I was desperate, Emma," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I didn't abandon you. I had no choice." The tension in the room was palpable. Emma's breath hitched, her mind scrambling to process his sudden appearance, his words. Memories collided with reality, creating a storm in her chest. But she couldn't falter. Not here, not now. Emma straightened, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You may have had your reasons," she said, her words deliberate, "but you made a choice to leave, and I made a choice to rise." The man's face shifted, his defiance softening into something unreadable. The audience was silent, hanging on every word, every movement. Emma could feel their support, their belief in her, and it steadied her resolve. "I'm not here to relive the past," Emma continued, addressing the room now. "I'm here to remind you that every life, regardless of where it begins, has value. And we all have the power to change someone's story for the better." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound washing over her like a wave of relief and vindication. The man hesitated, then retreated toward the back of the room, his figure shrinking into the shadows. Emma stood tall, her heart racing but her spirit unbroken. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger. This moment wasn't about her past, it was about her future and the futures of those who still needed a second chance. As the applause grew louder, Emma allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Today, she had proven that even in the face of adversity, light could prevail. At the back of the grand hall, Richard Blackwell stood frozen, his polished demeanor momentarily shattered. The powerful speech on stage faded into the background, drowned out by the rush of memories flooding his mind. The young woman before him, the one captivating an entire auditorium with her poise and passion, was unmistakable. The curve of her jaw, the determined glint in her eyes, all too familiar. His chest tightened as he whispered to himself, "That's my daughter, after all these years." Richard's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened, his knuckles white against the dark wood. He had buried the memory of the day he left her, rationalized it as a sacrifice made in desperation. But now, seeing Emma stand tall and unapologetic under the spotlight, the weight of his choices came crashing down on him. Emma's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "I stand here today not as someone extraordinary," she said, her tone steady but charged with emotion, "but as proof that love can change destinies." The words pierced Richard like an arrow. Love. He had failed to give her that when she needed it most. His mind raced back to the day he left her, the hollow promise that he would return. The excuses he had told himself over the years now felt flimsy, even shameful. On stage, Emma's conviction only grew. "We have the power to transform lives," she continued, her voice resonating with a rawness that pulled at every heart in the room. "Be the difference in a child's life. Choose to see them, to hear them, to love them. Because that love, it changes everything." The room erupted in applause, a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Emma's name was on every lip, her words etched into every soul present. The crowd rose to its feet in unison, their admiration pouring over her like a tide. Richard found himself standing too, though his movements felt mechanical. He clapped along with the others, but his hands moved out of reflex, not celebration. Inside, guilt and pride waged a bitter war. Guilt for the years he had lost, for the child he had left behind, pride for the woman she had become despite his absence. As the applause roared on, he couldn't take his eyes off Emma. She stood at the center of the stage, bathed in light, her head slightly bowed as if humbled by the reception. She was every bit the strong, compassionate person he had once dreamed she could become. But she had achieved it without him. The noise around him began to blur, and Richard's mind churned with questions. Could he approach her? Did he even have the right? How could he explain the years of silence, the pain he caused, and the cowardice that had defined his actions? His breath quickened as he wrestled with his emotions. The daughter he had abandoned was now a beacon of hope for countless others, and yet the shadow of his choices loomed large. The applause began to taper off, and the audience started to settle. Emma glanced up, her gaze sweeping the room one last time. For a fleeting moment, her eyes seemed to land on Richard. He stiffened, his heart lurching in his chest. Did she recognize him? Or was he just another face in the crowd to her now? Emma stepped away from the podium, her mission complete, but Richard's had only just begun. He knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without trying to bridge the chasm between them, no matter how impossible it seemed. As Emma disappeared backstage, the audience began to disperse, their conversations filled with praise and admiration. But Richard remained rooted in place, his hands still tingling from the applause. His daughter's words echoed in his mind. Choose to see them, to hear them, to love them. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of those words, and he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't turn his back on her again. The adrenaline still coursed through Emma's veins as she stepped outside the convention center. The crisp air was a welcome contrast to the heat of the spotlight she'd just left behind. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, not with fear this time, but with exhilaration. She dialed home, her heart racing as the call connected. "Emma?" Martha's warm voice filled the line, immediately soothing her nerves. "Mom," Emma said, her voice breaking with excitement. It was incredible. The audience, they stood up and clapped for so long. I wish you all had been there to see it. Martha's laugh was gentle, tinged with pride. "We didn't need to be there to know how amazing you were, sweetheart. We're so proud of you." Emma smiled, leaning against a lamppost as pedestrians hurried by. She could almost picture Martha in their cozy kitchen, her apron still on from breakfast, her face lit with love and joy. "Dad and Lucy will want to hear all about it," Martha continued. "But for now, take a moment to let it sink in. You've worked so hard for this." "I will," Emma promised, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "Always, my dear," Martha said softly. "Now go celebrate. You deserve it." Emma ended the call, her smile lingering as she pocketed her phone. The world around her seemed brighter, more alive. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of true accomplishment. Meanwhile, Richard's decision. Across the city, Richard Blackwell sat in his spacious office, the skyline stretching out behind him. The applause from the auditorium still echoed in his ears, mingling with Emma's words. The weight of what he'd witnessed bore down on him, leaving him restless and uneasy. He stared at the sleek black phone on his desk, his fingers tapping against its edge. For years he had avoided confronting his past, burying himself in his work and convincing himself that his decisions had been necessary. But now, those rationalizations felt hollow. Emma wasn't just a distant memory anymore. She was real, vibrant, and standing at the forefront of a cause that had captivated an entire audience, a cause that stemmed from a pain he had caused. His jaw tightened as he made up his mind. He couldn't ignore this, not anymore. Reaching for his phone, he opened a text thread with his assistant. "Richard, get me all the information you can on Emma Johnson. Urgent." He stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. It felt strange, formal even, to inquire about his own daughter through an assistant. But after years of distance, he wasn't sure how else to start. The reply came quickly. "Assistant, on it, sir. I'll have a file ready within the hour." Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the flicker of pride that refused to be extinguished. Emma had become someone extraordinary, and he couldn't help but wonder if there was still room in her life for the man who had failed her so deeply. As the city's lights began to twinkle in the approaching dusk, Richard sat in silence, his mind swirling with possibilities. Would Emma even want to see him? Could he explain his choices? Would she ever forgive him? One thing was clear: the distance he had maintained for so long was no longer sustainable. It was time to face the consequences of his past and, perhaps, find a way to reconnect with the daughter he had lost. The glow of Emma's phone illumined her face as she sat curled up on the couch in her small apartment. The exhaustion of the day's triumph had started to settle in, but her mind refused to rest. She scrolled through her messages absent-mindedly until a notification appeared, one that made her heart skip. The sender was an unknown number. The message was brief, yet it carried the weight of something monumental. "Miss Johnson, I have important information about your past. Can we meet?" Emma stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. A flurry of emotions surged through her. Curiosity, apprehension, and a strange sense of longing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she stopped herself. She needed advice before diving into whatever this was. She grabbed her coat and hurried across town to her adoptive parents' home. When Martha opened the door, her warm smile faded as she saw Emma's expression. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Martha asked, leading Emma into the living room, where Julia, Emma's best friend, was waiting with a cup of tea. Emma sank into a chair and held up her phone, her voice shaking slightly as she explained. "I got this message. Someone named Linda. She says she has important information about my past." Martha frowned, her brows knitting in concern. Julia leaned forward, her eyes scanning the message on the screen. "Do you know anyone named Linda?" Julia asked, her voice calm but tinged with worry. Emma shook her head. "No, but something about it feels different. Like maybe she's telling the truth." Martha exchanged a glance with Julia, her maternal instincts on high alert. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "be careful. You don't know who this person is or what they want." Emma nodded, gripping the phone tightly in her hands. "I know, Mom, but if there's even a chance this could give me answers, I need to find out." "Then don't go alone," Julia interjected, "and make sure it's in a public place, no risks." "I'll arrange to meet her in public," Emma agreed, her voice firmer now. "This isn't something I can ignore." Martha's face softened, though the worry in her eyes remained. "Just promise me you'll be cautious. No matter what this person has to say, remember who you are and where you come from." Emma reached for her adoptive mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I will, Mom. I promise." Julia leaned back in her chair, her tone taking on its usual teasing edge. And if she's shady, you've got me. I'll glare her into submission." Emma let out a small laugh, the tension in the room easing slightly. But as she looked back at her phone, the weight of the message settled over her again. She typed out a quick reply. "Linda, I'm willing to meet. Let's do it in a public place. When and where?" The message sent, and Emma set the phone down, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. Somewhere, a door to her past was opening, and she had no choice but to step through it. Meanwhile, Linda's resolved. Across the city, Linda sat in a dimly lit cafe, her fingers trembling as she placed her phone on the table. The message from Emma flashed on the screen, and she exhaled shakily. It had taken her years to muster the courage to reach out, and now that she had, there was no turning back. For too long, Linda had lived with the shadow of her decisions, watching Emma from afar as she grew into a remarkable young woman. She had stayed silent, believing it was for the best. But after seeing Emma's speech today, Linda knew she couldn't remain in the background any longer. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, clutching the locket she wore around her neck, "tomorrow, she'll know everything." The stage was set, and both women were about to face truths that could change their lives forever. The familiar hum of Central Cafe greeted Emma as she stepped inside, her nerves coiled tight. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint chatter of patrons, but Emma hardly noticed. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on a woman sitting in the corner by the window. The woman had a tentative air about her, her hands clasped around a steaming cup as though it were the only thing tethering her to the moment. Emma approached, her heart pounding. The woman stood as Emma neared, her gaze hesitant but filled with something Emma couldn't yet place. Regret, perhaps, or hope. "Emma," the woman said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm Linda. I'm your biological mother." Emma froze for a moment, the weight of those words settling over her. Her expression remained calm, though her mind raced. After a beat, she gestured to the seat across from her. "Please, sit." Linda sat down, fidgeting with her cup. Emma took the chair opposite, her tone steady as she asked, "Why now, after all these years?" Late in the afternoon, the radiant sunset outside the cafe window painted the atmosphere in a warm orange glow. Linda arrived at the agreed meeting spot, a small cafe nestled beside a quiet alley. She tightened her hands around the cup, her eyes fixed on the table. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer, but then she looked up, her expression raw with emotion. "I was young and scared," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father, Richard, convinced me that giving you up was the best thing to do. He told me I couldn't raise you, that it would ruin both our lives. And I believed him." Emma's stomach twisted, but she said nothing, letting Linda continue. "Was powerful," Linda said, her voice growing steadier as the words poured out. "He promised me it was for your sake, that you'd have a better life without me. But the truth?" Her voice cracked. "He wanted to avoid a scandal. He didn't want anyone to know he had a child with someone like me, a nobody." Emma's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. The cool, composed demeanor she had worked so hard to maintain began to fray at the edges. "I should have fought for you," Linda said, tears brimming in her eyes. "But I didn't. I let him scare me, and I've regretted it every day since. I've watched you from afar, seen the incredible person you've become, and I've wanted to reach out so many times. But I thought you'd hate me for what I did." Emma took a slow breath, her voice measured. "And why did you finally decide to reach out now?" Linda hesitated, her gaze falling to the table. "Your speech, I watched it, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. I knew I had to tell you the truth no matter what." The cafe seemed to fade around them, the clinking of cups and murmured conversations replaced by the weight of Linda's confession. Emma stared at the woman in front of her, trying to reconcile the person she was now with the faceless figure who had haunted her thoughts for so long. Her voice was calm but carried an edge of steel as she finally spoke. "I don't know what to do with this, Linda. You left me. You let him convince you to walk away." Linda flinched, the guilt in her eyes deepening. "I know," she whispered, "and I can never undo that. But I'm here now, Emma. I wanted you to know the truth, to know that you were never unwanted, never unloved." Emma leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she studied Linda. The sincerity in her words was undeniable, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside her. "I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough," Emma said, her voice low but firm. "Why you and Richard, my biological parents, decided I didn't matter." "You do matter," Linda said desperately, leaning forward. "More than you'll ever know. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. Not for my sake, but for yours, so you can have the answers you've been searching for." Emma let the silence stretch between them, her emotions churning. The truth was a double-edged sword. It brought clarity, but it also cut deep. After what felt like an eternity, Emma spoke, her tone still guarded. "I'm not sure forgiveness is something I can give right now, but I'll listen. I'll hear you out." Linda nodded, her eyes glistening with the mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you," she said quietly. As the conversation continued, the walls Emma had built around her heart began to crack, piece by piece. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, the path to understanding her past felt within reach. The warmth of the cafe felt stifling as Emma and Linda continued their tense conversation. The air between them was thick with unresolved emotions, and Emma's mind raced to keep up with the revelations pouring from Linda's lips. "I can't believe how much I've missed," Linda was saying, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to lose the chance to know you now, Emma. A sudden commotion at the door cut her off. Emma looked up, startled, as a man holding a notepad and a camera burst into the cafe. His presence was like a lightning bolt, electrifying the air and drawing all eyes toward him. He scanned the room briefly before striding purposely toward their table. "Miss Johnson?" the journalist said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Is it true you're the daughter of Richard Blackwell?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Emma froze, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Across from her, Linda went pale, her hand flying to her mouth as though she could physically stop the truth from spilling out. "Excuse me?" Emma managed, her voice sharper than she intended. The journalist ignored her tone, leaning forward eagerly. "Sources say that Richard Blackwell, the billionaire businessman, is your biological father. Can you confirm or deny this?" The cafe erupted into murmurs, patrons craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Linda sank deeper into her seat, her expression a mix of guilt and panic. Her silence was deafening. Emma's stomach churned as realization dawned. She turned her gaze to Linda, her eyes narrowing. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice low but shaking with barely contained emotion. "Richard Blackwell is my father." Linda hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her cup. "Emma, Answer me!" Emma's voice cut through the rising noise in the cafe, and all conversations came to a halt. Linda's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered, "he's your father." The confirmation felt like a blow to the chest. Emma's breath hitched, and for a moment, she could hear nothing but the rush of blood in her ears. Her thoughts spiraled, flashes of her childhood blending with the image of the man she now knew as her father. The pieces of her life that had never quite fit together suddenly snapped into place, forming a picture she wasn't ready to see. The journalist, sensing the chaos he had unleashed, pressed further. "Miss Johnson, how does it feel to be connected to one of the most powerful men in the country? Were you aware of your lineage before today?" Emma shot him a glare that could have cut through steel. "I think you've done enough," she said coldly, her voice carrying an authority that made him falter. He hesitated, then muttered something about needing to write his story before retreating. The cafe's buzz returned as people whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Emma and Linda. Emma turned back to Linda, her emotions now boiling over. "So this is what you came here to tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and betrayal. "That my father is some untouchable billionaire who didn't even want me?" "No, Emma, I swear." Linda reached across the table, her desperation palpable. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I was going to tell you, but I needed you to understand the whole story first." "What part of the story?" Emma snapped, pulling away from Linda's outstretched hand. "The part where he abandoned me? Or the part where you let him?" Tears streamed down Linda's face as she shook her head. "It's not that simple. Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "It's always been simple," she said, her voice hard. "You both made a choice, and I was the one who paid for it." The cafe seemed to close in around her, the weight of the revelation suffocating. Emma needed space, air, anything to escape the oppressive tide of emotions threatening to drown her. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the door. Linda called after her, but Emma didn't stop. The cool air hit her face as she stepped outside, and she gulped it down, her chest heaving. The city buzzed around her, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. "Richard Blackwell," she muttered to herself, her voice bitter. "My father." The name felt foreign on her tongue, yet it carried a strange familiarity. She thought back to the man in the audience at her speech, the one whose face had seemed so intent, so haunted. Could it have been him? Had he known who she was all along? Her thoughts spiraled as she walked aimlessly through the bustling streets, her mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and an ache she couldn't name. For years, she had built her identity on resilience, on rising above the pain of abandonment. And now, the foundation she had created felt as though it were cracking beneath her feet. Questions flooded her mind. Why had Linda reached out now? Why had Richard never come for her? Did he even care? And, most painfully, did she want him to? As the city blurred around her, Emma realized one thing with sharp clarity. This wasn't over. The truth she had been searching for had only begun to reveal itself, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the answers waiting ahead, but she would face them. She had no choice. Emma stood in front of the sleek glass building, her reflection staring back at her from the towering facade. Her heart thudded in her chest, the enormity of what she was about to face pressing down on her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the doors and stepped into the pristine lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The receptionist guided her to a private elevator, and within moments she was on the top floor. The office was as intimidating as the man who occupied it. Large windows showcasing the sprawling city, polished wood and understated luxury. It was a world away from the life Emma had known. Richard Blackwell stood as she entered, his tailored suit impeccable, his face unreadable. He looked older than she remembered from her speech, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture slightly wary. "Emma," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps, or hope? "Thank you for coming. I owe you the truth." A few hours after talking with her biological mother, Emma asked her to take her to her biological father, who had abandoned her as a child. Her mother led Emma directly to the man's workplace. Emma crossed her arms, her gaze unflinching. "I didn't come for pleasantries. I came for answers. Why did you abandon me?" Richard flinched at her words, his carefully constructed composure faltering. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit. Let me explain." Emma hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her eyes never leaving his. Richard sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "When I found out about you, I was young, ambitious, and reckless. My business was just starting to take off, but it wasn't exactly clean. I was involved in deals that couldn't withstand scrutiny, and when I learned that Linda was pregnant..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "You were afraid of a scandal," Emma finished for him, her tone sharp. "Yes," Richard admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought acknowledging you would bring everything crashing down. My career, my reputation. It all felt too fragile to risk, so I made a choice, a coward's choice." Emma's throat tightened, but she refused to let him see her pain. "You thought hiding me would protect your empire." Richard nodded slowly. "I convinced myself I was protecting you too. I told myself that you'd have a better life without being tied to me. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was selfish and afraid. And I failed you." The weight of his words hung in the air, but Emma wasn't ready to let go of her anger. "You didn't just fail me," she said, her voice rising. "You let me believe I wasn't wanted. Do you know what that does to a child? To grow up wondering why they weren't enough?" Richard's face crumpled, and for the first time he looked vulnerable. "I can't take back what I did," he said softly. "And I can't undo the pain I caused you. But I want to try to make it right, if you'll let me." Emma leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed tightly. "I didn't come here for you, Richard. I came for me. To understand. To close the gaps in my story. But if you think you can just walk back into my life and fix things with an apology, you're wrong." Richard nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet acceptance. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, Emma. I don't even expect a relationship. I wanted you to know the truth. To know that you were never unloved." Emma's jaw clenched, her emotions warring within her. A part of her wanted to lash out, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused her. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, wanted to believe him. "If we're going to build anything," Emma said finally, her voice steady, "it starts now. Not with the past, not with excuses or regrets. You don't get to rewrite history to make yourself feel better." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "You set the terms. Whatever you need, I'll follow your lead." Emma stood, her movements deliberate. "We'll see, Richard. Actions speak louder than words. If you really mean what you're saying, prove it. Show me you've changed." Richard rose as well, his towering frame somehow subdued. "I will," he promised, "whatever it takes." Emma turned and walked toward the door, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she believed him, but she knew one thing. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her story, and for now, that was enough. The decision to go public wasn't easy, but Emma knew it was necessary. The whirlwind of revelations about her connection to Richard Blackwell had already begun to ripple through the media, threatening to spin out of control. Sitting in her family's small living room, Emma leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We'll tell our story on our terms," she said, her voice firm. Her adoptive mother, Martha, nodded in quiet support from her seat beside Emma. Across from them, Linda and Richard exchanged uncertain glances. "You're sure about this?" Richard asked, his tone measured but cautious. Emma's gaze was unwavering. "Yes, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that hiding only gives the past more power. This is about reclaiming our narrative. We can't let the past define us." Linda exhaled softly, her fingers twisting in her lap. "And what will we say? The truth is messy." "Messy or not, it's ours," Emma replied. "We'll focus on what matters: hope, second chances, and moving forward." Richard's lips tightened as he absorbed her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." The large conference room buzzed with anticipation as reporters jostled for seats, their cameras flashing even before the event began. The Blackwell name had drawn the media like moths to a flame, and Emma could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her as she stepped onto the stage. The table at the front of the room was set with microphones, and Emma took her place between Linda and Richard. Behind them, a banner displayed the logo of her NGO, its slogan boldly declaring, "Every child deserves a chance." Richard leaned into the microphone first, his expression somber but resolute. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "Today, I want to address not only the media but also my daughter, Emma Johnson." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the tension palpable. Richard pressed on. "I am not proud of the choices I made in the past. For years, I prioritized my career, my reputation, and my ambition over what truly mattered. I abandoned my daughter when she needed me most, and that is a mistake I will carry for the rest of my life." The room was silent, save for the clicks of cameras. Richard's vulnerability, so unexpected from a man of his stature, hung in the air. "To begin making amends," he continued, "I am donating $10 million to Emma's NGO, an organization that fights for the very children I once failed to protect. But this is just the beginning. My actions from this point forward will speak louder than any words." He stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he glanced at Emma. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned to Linda. Linda hesitated before speaking, her voice softer but filled with determination. "As a young mother, I made decisions out of fear and pressure, decisions that haunt me to this day. But standing here now, I want to use my mistakes to advocate for single mothers who feel trapped and voiceless. No one should ever feel alone or unsupported in raising their children." A wave of applause began, hesitant at first, but growing as the room absorbed her heartfelt words. Linda sat back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and Emma stepped forward. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This isn't just a story about mistakes," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It's a story about redemption, resilience, and hope. It's about proving that our past does not define us. It's our choices, our actions, and the love we give that shape who we are." The cameras were locked on her now, the room hanging on her every word. "My father abandoned me," she said bluntly, the honesty cutting through the air like a knife. "And my biological mother made decisions that hurt me deeply. But today, we are here together to say that second chances are possible, not just for us, but for every child, every mother, every family who has been broken by circumstances beyond their control." Emma paused, her voice softening. "This is about hope. It's about second chances for every child who feels forgotten and every parent who feels like they've failed. Because when we choose to see each other, to love each other, we can change lives." The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that brought a lump to Emma's throat. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for the countless children her organization would continue to help. Richard stood beside her, his expression one of quiet pride, while Linda wiped tears from her eyes. Emma turned to look at Martha and Julia, seated in the front row, their smiles beaming with love and support. This moment wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a better future, together. The press conference had concluded hours ago, but its echoes lingered in Emma's mind as she sat in the quiet of her apartment. The storm of emotions had calmed, leaving her in a strange limbo. On one hand, she felt liberated, having reclaimed her story on her terms. On the other, the future felt uncertain, a road stretching out before her with no clear map. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Richard standing there, holding a slim leather folder. His expression was cautious, almost hesitant. "May I come in?" he asked. Emma stepped aside, motioning him toward the small couch. He sat, the grandeur of his tailored suit a stark contrast to her cozy, cluttered living room. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Richard began, placing the folder on the coffee table between them. Emma folded her arms, leaning against the armrest. "Go on." Richard cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the press conference. About second chances, about making a difference. It struck me that I've been running my businesses with one goal in mind, profit, but you've shown me there's a greater purpose, one I've ignored for too long." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I want you to run the philanthropic branch of my foundation. You'll have access to resources, funding, and connections to expand the work you're already doing through your NGO." Emma blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" "Completely," Richard said, his voice steady but sincere. "I don't expect this to fix anything between us, but I believe in what you're doing. This isn't about me, it's about helping the people you fight for." Emma's eyes flicked to the folder, her mind already racing with the possibilities. But she wasn't ready to leap into his offer without thought. "I need time to decide," she said, her tone measured. Richard nodded, standing. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He hesitated at the door, turning back before he left. "For what it's worth, Emma, I'm proud of you." Later that evening, Emma sat with Martha at the kitchen table, the folder unopened in front of her. Martha poured her a cup of tea, her gentle presence soothing as always. "Are you going to take it?" Martha asked, nodding toward the folder. Emma sighed, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "I don't know, Mom. It's a huge opportunity, but..." She trailed off, her thoughts tangled. Martha reached over, placing a hand on Emma's. "You've always been good at listening to your heart, sweetheart. What's it telling you?" Emma stared into her tea, her voice quiet but firm. "That I'm not leaving anyone behind. I'm not abandoning the family that raised me, or the people I've fought for. But maybe this is a chance to expand my circle of love, to do more, reach more, without losing who I am." Martha smiled, her pride evident. "Then I think you already know what to do." The next morning, Emma walked into Richard's office, her steps confident. He looked up from his desk, surprised but hopeful. "I'll take the role," Emma said, her voice calm but resolute. "But on two conditions." Richard stood, giving her his full attention. "Name them." "First," Emma began, crossing her arms, "I want total autonomy. I'll oversee the philanthropic branch my way, with no interference from you or anyone else." Richard nodded without hesitation. "Done." "Second," Emma continued, her tone hardening, "this doesn't buy a relationship between us. If we're going to rebuild anything, it won't come from deals or power plays. It will come from actions, not words." Richard's expression softened, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Understood. I don't want to force anything, Emma. I just want you to have the tools to make the difference you're already making." Emma extended her hand. "Then we have a deal." Richard shook it firmly, his respect for her clear. As she turned to leave, a small smile played on her lips. This wasn't the ending. It was a beginning. Not just for her work, but for her own healing and the possibility of building something new. On her terms, in her time. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the backyard, where laughter and chatter mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and sizzling barbecue. Balloons bobbed gently in the breeze, tied to the corners of a long table laden with food. It was a special occasion, one that marked not just time past, but lives forever intertwined. Emma stood near the table, watching as her adoptive parents, Martha and Robert, chatted animatedly with Linda. The tension of their early meetings had given way to something softer, warmer. A shared understanding forged through love for Emma. Lucy was nearby, sneaking cookies off a tray and grinning when caught. Even Richard, once an intimidating figure, now leaned against the fence, smiling faintly as he watched the scene unfold. It had been a year since Emma had stood on the stage at the press conference, baring her soul and confronting her past. A year since she'd taken the reins of Richard's philanthropic branch, turning it into a force for good. But, more importantly, it had been a year of healing, of growth, of redefining what family meant. As the group gathered around the table, Martha tapped her glass, signaling for attention. The soft clinking quieted the chatter, and all eyes turned toward her. "Today, we're not just celebrating an anniversary," Martha began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We're celebrating Emma, the incredible woman she's become, and the journey that's brought her here." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat as Martha continued. "When we adopted Emma, we couldn't have imagined how much she'd teach us about resilience, about love, and about the power of second chances." Martha glanced at Linda, who stepped forward, her own glass trembling slightly in her hand. "I know I've missed so much," Linda said, her voice wavering. "And I know I'll never fully make up for that. But in the time we've had together, Emma, you've shown me grace I didn't deserve. You've let me be part of your life, and I'll be forever grateful for that." Linda paused, her eyes glistening as she exchanged a glance with Richard. He stepped forward, his usual stoicism softened by the moment. "We've been talking," Linda said, looking back at Emma, "and we'd like to ask you something." Emma tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" Linda took a breath, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We'd like to adopt you legally. Not to replace what you already have, but to add to it, to make official what's already in our hearts." The air seemed to still as everyone waited for Emma's response. She felt her chest tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on her in the most beautiful way. Her gaze shifted to Martha and Robert, who nodded, their expressions filled with love and encouragement. Tears filled Emma's eyes as she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Linda and then Richard. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I'd love that." Applause and cheers erupted around them, laughter mingling with tears as the family embraced. Emma found herself enveloped by her parents, siblings, and newfound family, each connection stronger than ever before. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Emma sat beneath a sprawling oak tree, watching the twinkling fairy lights strung across the yard. Lucy plopped down beside her, handing her a glass of lemonade. "You okay?" Lucy asked, her tone playful but tinged with genuine concern. "Oh," Emma smiled, taking a sip. "I'm more than okay. I'm I'm content. Lucy leaned back, her head resting against the tree trunk. You deserve it, you know. Everything that's happened, everything you've done, you've earned this. Emma let the words settle, her thoughts drifting. She glanced back at the group by the fire pit. Martha and Robert laughing as they roasted marshmallows, Linda deep in conversation with Richard, and Julia spinning a story that had everyone in stitches. It's funny, Emma said softly. For so long, I thought family was just blood. But it's so much more than that. It's love. It's support. It's the people who stand by you when things get hard, and the ones who celebrate with you when things go right. Lucy nudged her shoulder. That's poetic, sis. Emma laughed, her heart light. It's true, though. This year, it's taught me so much about forgiveness, about boundaries, about opening my heart without losing myself. Lucy grinned. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're doing a pretty good job. Emma turned to her sister, pulling her into a quick hug. Thanks, Lucy. That means everything. As the night deepened and the last guests began to leave, Emma lingered in the yard, taking in the quiet. Richard approached her, his steps tentative. Emma, he began, I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance, for letting me be part of this. Emma studied him for a moment, then nodded. It wasn't easy, and it's not perfect, but I've learned that nothing worth having ever is. Richard smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. I'm proud of you. More than words can say. Emma's lips quirked into a small smile. I'm proud of me too. As he walked away, Emma tilted her head toward the stars, the night wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Her journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt whole. She whispered softly to herself, a mantra for the life she had built and the one she would continue to shape. Family isn't just blood, it's love and support, and it's what we choose to create. The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of everything she had learned, a promise to herself and to those who had become her family. The night stretched on, but Emma remained, carrying the lessons of her journey into a future bright with possibility.